And well, hello. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me and that this is working. This is our first foray into YouTube Live, so who knows how this is going to go. But welcome to Monday of Holy Week, right? So this is the sort of beginning of this journey. We started yesterday with Palm Sunday, and so think about what Palm Sunday was. Palm Sunday, we we even work out actually something like it's probably originating today, where what we do with Palm Sunday is we symbolically think about this journey that begins into Good Friday, and then of course the resurrection is always kind of hanging in our sort of in the background of our minds when we think about Palm Sunday. But Palm Sunday is this symbolic beginning to the week of Holy Week. So when we wave palm branches, as we should do when we're not in isolation, and we decorate our buildings and think about Palm Sunday, we're leaning into symbolism. And the reason I think that's quite important and worth sort of mentioning and thinking about when we talk about Palm Sunday is that Palm Sunday, originally at the time of Jesus, was a symbolic moment. He's acting out. We talked about this in our teaching a little bit yesterday. He's acting out a prophetic scene, an image of that will mean something to the people who are watching it at that particular time. These people are going to see this person coming into Jerusalem on a donkey, and they know that symbolically he's saying something about the arrival of the Messiah, the arrival of rescue. And the people's response to wave palm branches is actually suggesting that they understand what's going on in this scene. They get that this is a prophetic act, because the waving of palm branches was a way of kind of welcoming in a savior. So we know where Holy Week starts, right? Holy Week starts here at the beginning on Palm Sunday, and we know where it ends. We know that Friday is coming, and that Jesus is going to be crucified. We know that beyond that lies the resurrection. We know that on Thursday, Jesus is going to sit and have the Last Supper with his disciples. The Last Supper, but also the first time that communion, that Eucharist, that sort of service happens in our church history, and something that we all copy and live with even to this day in our churches. And we'll be doing it online and live on Thursday as a church. But there's a few extra days prior to this Thursday and after this Palm Sunday. And so at some level, my kind of thinking today was, what happens on Monday? What goes on the Monday of Jesus's Holy Week as he leads this journey towards the cross? Well, Mark actually tells us this. Mark tells us in chapter 11 of his gospel, at verse 12, he says this: the next day, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts. And he began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? You've made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this, and they began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. That's Mark chapter 11 and verse 12 through to verse 18. Now think about this. What you actually hear goes on this Monday is actually what starts to begin the wheels turning that ends up with Jesus's death on Friday. It's not the triumphal entrance that really worries and upsets the kind of political leaders of Jesus's time. Rather, what it is, it's this act that he makes in the temple, this scene that he works out. I kind of wonder if it's worth us thinking about this scene just for a moment, right? This is happening in Jerusalem. This is not happening in Calgary, right? So, why is that important? Well, at Calgary, there's many places you can go to engage in worship, right? There's all sorts of locations you can go to, whether your particular religion is different or whether your particular take on a particular way of thinking about Jesus is different. You've got options. But Jerusalem in the first century, and for many years of the Jewish people, there's the temple, and that's it. So you're either going to the temple to worship, or you're going nowhere else. And so this is the only place to go, and it's the only place to go and worship. And it's a huge place. I mean, all you need to do is grab Google. It's nearby, probably where you are right now, and you can basically Google what it looked like, what the temple looked like. This Herod's second temple is what it's often known as. It's a huge place, and not only is this place huge, it's in Jerusalem during the week of Passover. So it is crowded in Jerusalem. The population of Jerusalem swells massively during Passover, and they're all heading into that sort of temple area. The problem is, and again, I've talked about this in the past, and you can read it extensively online. The temple has become corrupt over the years. So what's happened at the time of Jesus is the temple isn't really fulfilling its intended function, and there's a whole host of other stuff going on. And sometimes when we look at this passage and we hear about money changers and people selling things, we think, oh, that's the corruption. But it's not quite that. That was just a sort of helpful function of society, that they basically allowed people to buy and sell their offerings and their sacrifices in the temple courts to make it easier for people who are traveling from far apart. If you're coming from Ephesus, for example, and then you wanting to come to Jerusalem for Passover, you don't want to be bringing your offerings and your sacrifices that whole distance, right? So being able to buy something from the temple is functional and helpful. But the temple has become a scene where the corruption is going on, the exploitation of people, the overcharging of people. It's become a power mechanism rather than a place of worship. So imagine you're in this place. It's the only place of worship in Jerusalem. It's crammed with people. It's full on the day that you go there, and then over in a corner somewhere, all of a sudden this commotion starts, and you can hear all of this kind of something's going on. You've been in one of those situations surely in your life where something happens over there. Maybe it's the other side of the bar or the other side of the street, and all of a sudden everybody's eyes are turned, and we're looking at this thing, and we're saying, oh my goodness, what's happening? What's happening over there? And there's a guy, and he's made a whip out of some stuff that he seems to have just found lying around, and he's chasing people out of this space of the temple. He's turning tables over. Imagine the noise, and the coins and jars are smashing and breaking. And also bear in mind, a lot of these people are selling animals for sacrifice and offerings, right? So I'm kind of envisaging sheep running around and doves flying off in the air. And basically, this is not an ordinary day at the temple. Like, this is not what you regularly see when you're there. But like, what's going on with Jesus here? Is he mad? Is that what we're encountering? Is this Jesus losing his temper? Is this angry Jesus? And sometimes I think people have talked about this scene almost as a justification for anger and rage. We say, oh well, hey, look, Jesus got angry once, so now it's okay for us to be angry. And then other people have questions and said, well, does Jesus lose his temper, and is that wrong? And are we okay with Jesus sort of doing that? And I don't think any of those things are actually how we should look at this particular story. Rather, all the things we learned in Palm Sunday become helpful to us as we learn to read this moment here on the Monday of Holy Week. Palm Sunday, if you think about Palm Sunday as just, hey, Jesus had to get to Jerusalem, so he used a donkey, you kind of miss the point of that story. This is him symbolically working something out so that people can see it and join dots in their mind. So exactly the same thing now becomes true on this first Monday of Holy Week, and this sort of story that's known as the clearing of the temple. This is a symbolic act by Jesus. If you actually read the text carefully, you'll notice that he had a little look around the temple the day before, and now he's come back. This isn't an emotional response. It's not some overwhelming rage that Jesus is encountering. Rather, what this is Jesus working out an image, and it's an image that's rooted deeply in the prophetic language of the Old Testament. It's an image that people who had read scripture in Jesus's time would recognize, and I think they would understand. And the response of the leaders of the time suggests that at least somebody understood what Jesus was saying. Let me explain it. Let me explain it like this. Right? Religious life has always easily gotten out of sync. Perhaps you have noticed this in your own experience. We have these ideas and dreams about what we'd accomplish by a particular belief structure and worldview, but very quickly it seems to become about something else. So our love as humans for process and for tradition quickly becomes more important to us than our love for God and our love for each other. So let me say that again. So our love for process and for tradition and for the way we do things very easily and very quickly becomes more important to us than our love for God and for one another. And of course, for the Bible, loving God and loving one another are the same thing. That how we work out our love for God is shown in how we love one another. Now, in the Old Testament, in which would be the Bible that Jesus worked with and read in his time, remember, the Old Testament had always been warned. The readers of the Old Testament have many, many occasions, particularly strongly in what we'd call the prophetic books, the books written by these great prophets of Israel. You see God constantly warning the people that if the temple got too much out of sync, for want of a better way to say it, if it forgets its purpose, if it starts to define itself by something other than the purpose that God gave it, then God basically really clearly says throughout the Old Testament that he would just shut it down. He would bring it to a close, and he would cause things to happen that would basically stop the temple going forward. Because if it's not going to do what it's supposed to be doing, then it may as well not be there, right? And so symbolically, this is what Jesus does here on this Monday at the beginning of Holy Week, right? It's a micro level, right? So don't think that Jesus drives everybody out and then they go, okay, well, I better go find a new job now and go somewhere else. No, it's pretty likely that probably within a couple of minutes, hours, or, at very least by the end of the day, everybody's back and kind of business carries on as normal. But for a very brief moment, for a very micro level, Jesus makes a macro point. So Jesus makes a point about bringing the temple to a close. And if you're there watching this scene, I think you join the dots quite quickly. God said, for example, in Amos, he said that the temple was always supposed to be the place where justice and righteousness existed. In fact, Amos's sort of dream for God's people is that justice would flow forth like a river and righteousness like a never-ending stream. The temple was not designed to be a place that just kind of propped up religious practices and religious observances. In fact, listening to Jesus' language, he says this is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. And all nations doesn't mean it's a place where some people come to pray for all the other nations, but rather, again, the Old Testament was always very clear with this, that the temple was a place where ultimately the belief was that every nation would come and there they would encounter the true God. So when Jesus pauses the temple, for even if it's only for a few minutes, when he brings everything to a halt and he stops the corruption and he stops the processing and he stops the temple from operating, even just for a micro amount of time, he creates this prophetic image of warning about what God has always said. That if we get out of sync with what it is he's supposed to do, he brings that religious processing to a halt. And I would like to suggest that what Jesus is doing in this story is he's changing the narrative. He's changing the story arc. We thought the story was going this way, and we thought we knew how it worked, and Passover's coming, and we know how to go about dealing with Passover. And then Jesus kind of turns it around and sort of points it in a different direction. Jesus is going to change the story and put different things first. He's not going to put the kind of processes and the practices of temple first, but rather he's going to bring it back and suggest something other. And he does this by turning tables over and driving out the money changers. And here we are in 2020, in a place right now where if we can just kind of lean into the metaphorical aspects of this story for a moment, here we are in a place where it kind of feels like all of our tables have been turned over, right? You kind of know what that feeling is at the minute to have your tables turned over. Like so many of the things that we loved about church. Let's talk about that as an example. We're on a church live stream at the moment, aren't we? But like our love for what we do and how we gather as church has been turned around, and it's very different now. As much as we appreciate sitting in front of a live stream and watching services, it's still not quite the same, right? And our lives have been turned upside down as well. In fact, pretty much every quantifiable part of our lives, our friendships, our families, our other relationships, our work context, our vacation plans, our hobbies, our church life, everything has been turned over. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying here. I'm not kind of drawing a line and saying, "Oh, everything's been turned over in our lives at the minute because God's, angry about how we're doing things." I think that's to misunderstand the Bible. Despite I do hear people out there trying to say that they're trying to make an A to B point and say, "Well, this is happening because God's not happy about this, that, or the next thing." And I don't think that's a way to read the Bible. I think, and I said this in our teaching yesterday, a much better way to read Scripture about this is that we live in a broken world, and unfortunately, broken things happen. But history in Jesus causes us to look further beyond that and keep trusting in Jesus. So when I talk about our lives being overturned, I'm not trying to draw a kind of parallel between what's going on now with the coronavirus and what Jesus did in the temple. Rather, what I'm asking about is, can we relate to what it feels like to having things turned upside down? Now, maybe a different way to put it is like this. It's still Lent. like can you remember Ash Wednesday? Like normally that journey from Ash Wednesday to Lent, we're all here at Good Friday going, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it's Easter already." But this has been like a long time. It feels like, oh my goodness, what has happened between Ash Wednesday and where we are right now. So we're still in Lent, which makes me want to ask you this question. Can you remember what you thought you were giving up for Lent? Can you even remember what you were giving up for for Lent? Can you? How did you do with that, by the way? Like most years, I struggle to actually really uphold my Lenten fast. There's always like a moment where you find yourself just out of habit going through something, and you're like, "Oh my goodness, I thought I was going to stop this, and now here I am doing it again." But this year, like I spoke to people and friends, and they're like, "Oh, I was going to give up chocolate, or I was going to give up social media," and then it's like, "Yeah, no, this is not the time for that." And then in another way, this Lent felt so difficult because, well, it feels like we've given up everything this Lent. But Lent is Lent is supposed to help us strip away our pretenses and focus on God. And so what we do with Lent is we enact in really small ways, like with a bit of chocolate or caffeine or alcohol or social media or something like that. We say, "Okay, I'm going to step away from these things. And in that minor amount of sacrifice, this will help me focus on God." But this year, you know, let's be honest, the stripping away has been brutal. And it's not been our choice. It's not been something we planned to do. It's not been something that we wanted to do. But I still think it's worth asking a question about focus. Like the mess and the overturned tables of our lives are still a problem for us, but they still give us an opportunity to focus, or rather to ask us the question about what are we trying to focus on in the midst of this? Are we focusing on all the sort of stuff that could be wrong, or are we actually trying to use this time to maybe keep trusting in God, to maybe just kind of doing what we always thought we were going to do in Lent? It's just that now it feels like it's not a symbolic act. It feels like it's real. It feels like we have been forced to give things up, and we now need to decide, what do we really need from God, and what does God really need from us? So here's the thing about this temple scene. Jesus is turning everything over. But you got to read deeper into the story. That sometimes, if we just think this story is about corruption and we just think that Jesus is just trying to kind of sort out the corruption, then what we'll assume is that the solution to the story is just putting all the tables back together again and operating better with a heart for everybody else. But of course, Jesus is doing something else. He's changing the story arc. Remember, he's moving how things go. In fact, in John's gospel, Jesus at this point says, "You could destroy this temple in 3 days, and I would raise it back up again." And everybody gets a little confused about that, but you realize that what Jesus is actually talking about is his own body. So what's going on in this story is Jesus is suggesting that people move their focus. Even a perfect temple isn't the solution. The solution is what Holy Week is driving us towards, is to point us towards Friday. Because the temple was supposed to be a place of righteousness, a place that justice poured forward from. But we know in the story it's not able to achieve this. So instead, what we find Jesus doing is pointing us towards where righteousness and hope and justice will come from. Not the place we expected. We maybe expected it in a holy place. We expected it in a more religious feeling space, but we get it in a cross. So whether it's the temple you're thinking about, or whether it's our own traditions, the things that we love to do, the focus needs to be towards something different. towards Jesus. And this is what Holy Week is trying to teach us. In fact, at some level, this is what we're always trying to teach. The role of the church in everything we do in the church, whether it's worshiping or whether it's teaching, Lent, and any other tradition that we do, the gathering together, the spending time to each other, the meeting in each other's homes, the missional practices, the ways that we serve, all of these things are about one particular thing. And that's pointing us towards Jesus, because that's where righteousness comes from. It's where hope comes from. It's where love and grace come from. So this temple chaos at the start of Holy Week is prepping us up for the solution that's coming at the end of the week, that you're just not going to find it all in your traditions and in your processes. Like we get out of sync really, really easily. We start valuing the wrong things. We start thinking that the wrong things are the first things, and we start prioritizing things the wrong way around, and we start to say, and in the same way as Jesus times, well, this is what the temple's supposed to look like, and Jesus is saying, what about righteousness, and what about what it's supposed to be doing? And I found myself reflecting on this, and maybe you have as well. I've been reflecting just recently on all of the things that usually annoy me in a church gathering. And I don't know if as a pastor you're supposed to be annoyed by things that happen in a church gathering, but I find myself quite often kind of just irritated by stuff that's maybe going on. It can be little things that I realize now particularly are very dumb. So things like did we start on time? And people have turned up to try and be here on time. We should start on time. Or is the coffee good enough? Have we got the grind right this morning? Are we producing a nice cup? Or are my graphics right during my teaching? Is that going to be a thing? Or do people like this new song? Or what's the temperature like? And all these sort of things that I now think about, and I'd have all of the things that irritate me on any one Sunday all grouped together into all happening on one particular Sunday, and I'd still take them all if it just allowed us to be together again in the same room. In fact, I wonder sometimes when I come back to church whether we'll all have a different perspective on what we used to like and not like, because just thank goodness we can all be in the same space again. But here's what I'm trying to say. The things that used to annoy me were never the first and the most important things. The question that should always be driving us is this pointing me towards Jesus? Is this driving me the way that hope comes from? It just so easily feels that the non-important things become the important things. And when life turns the tables on us, when life turns things upside down, it gives us a chance to stop and think and actually repurpose a little bit and put our focuses perhaps in different places and actually remember what it is that we're called to be. And so, as difficult as this time is, could it be that this particular time is a chance for us to hear again the story of Holy Week, but to hear it differently? As in our own place of chaos and overturnedness, we realize that we're still being pointed towards Jesus. What was perhaps metaphorical for us in previous years is now real for us in this year. That in the chaos and the overturnedness, we realize that perhaps some of the things we've hoped in, some of the things we've believed in, some of the things we've imagined are where our security is found, we're now this Holy Week being pointed towards the cross and pointed towards Good Friday and the Sunday that comes after it, and reminding us that that's where hope is found, because it's what Jesus has done for us and is doing for us. And that's what we need to trust, not in our traditions, not in temples, not in the things we're used to, but in the Jesus that God raised from the dead. And that's the story we're living in this week. Jesus said that the two most important commandments are to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And I can really, really easily come up with a better list than that. I can come up with a whole host of things that I want to love and believe are of first importance before I get to God and my neighbor and before even myself sometimes. But maybe we're all like that, and we all can find ourselves in places where we need a little bit of reorganization. So this Holy Week, in all of the upturning, may you find God still to be working. May you find that you find that this God is working in and for you, even though it doesn't feel like it, even though it might feel like everything is chaos. There's still an opportunity in the midst of this to find Easter and all of its story to be true, not just spiritually, but in everything that we do. And may God's grace and peace be with you tonight. Amen.